Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. Today we continue our look at Dr. Sigmund Freud. We're celebrating Dr. Freud's 150th birthday this year. And with me to talk about Dr. Freud is the college's other resident psychologist, Professor Sharla Krupansky. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Before we went on the air, the question arose, who is the father of psychology? Most people say it is Sigmund Freud, but the real answer is?
Wilhelm Wundt.
Wilhelm who?
Wundt.
And who was Wilhelm Wundt?
He wasn't a psychologist. He was a physiologist who had a laboratory and was able to use the scientific process to study some of the questions that were important at that time, like about introspection and some of those things. So he had the laboratory, so he's the father.
But Freud, of course, gets the press.
Yes, he gets the press.
Most people are also convinced, doubtless, that Sigmund Freud was a psychiatrist.
He was not a psychiatrist. He was a neurologist, a physiologist, and practiced as a neurologist. He did not study psychiatry or psychology.
He just developed an interest in this on his own.
Right. Through the experiences that he had and the people he was connected with, who through psychiatric hospitals. And
the most enduring symbol of Dr. Freud is the couch.
Mm-hmm.
How relevant is the couch to modern psychiatric medicine or modern psychology?
It may still be in use for someone who is Freudian or a psychoanalyst, but in most psychiatric offices or psychologists, there is probably not a couch that's used, at least not used in the way that Freud did. You wouldn't lay down and look away.
Maybe you sit down to watch TV.
You might sit down, you might sit on it.
It is such a symbol in a lot of the articles about Freud that have been coming out in the magazines, the newspapers, and various things. The couch is there. There was a wonderful picture of a college classroom somewhere, and with the professor of psychology and the students in their desk, and there's a couch in the middle.
Was that nice little chaise kind of couch?
Yeah, it's exactly. And there was where it was some article on psychology where it showed a father playing pitch with his son of the baseball, and in between was a couch. Why is the couch such a symbol of psychology?
Well, it's not really psychology, it's psychoanalysis.
Psychoanalysis.
Is what it's. And the way Freud used the couch is to have his patients, and he considered them patients, they were sick, and they would lie on the couch and face away from him. All of his theory is based on the unconscious mind, and that we have things that are repressed in our unconscious mind. And so his job is to try to get access to those. And so he doesn't want any pressure, any constraints, any expectations or anything like that put on this patient. He just wants that information to flow freely. So you're relaxed, you're nobody's staring at you, nobody has any kind of expectations, and he can't even like reward certain responses because you don't see him, so you're just lying there allowing information to flow freely from your unconscious mind.
And so the psychoanalyst sits in the chair with the notebook saying, very interesting.
Very interesting, yeah.
Once in a while.
Or maybe nothing at all.
Well, do modern psychiatry, the field of modern psychiatry, is that not considered an effective method anymore?
I think some people still do find that effective. The free association technique that Freud used, I would imagine some people still use that. Now psychiatry, modern psychiatry tends to be more medicine, chemical, trying to balance the neurotransmitters in our brain.
That would be a good distinction to make. What is the difference between psychology and psychiatry?
Of which Freud was neither one.
Right, exactly, of which Freud was neither one.
Psychiatry is medicine. The person who becomes a psychiatrist has to go to medical school first, and then they specialize in psychiatry, just like a ophthalmologist would go to medical school and then specialize in the eye.
Mm-hmm.
So typically psychiatrists view mental illness as a problem of the brain, of the chemicals in the brain. Whereas a psychologist, their degree is in psychology. They study human behavior, and they may or may not involve the use of chemicals. If a psychologist believes that you need some medication, then they're going to have to refer you either to a psychiatrist or just your regular MD to get that. They cannot prescribe medicine.
That was my next question, was to prescribe medicine. We had our colleague and friend, Dr. Doug Pruitt, on the program before, and we were talking about the legacy of Sigmund Freud 150 years later. Why should we be celebrating his birthday, other than the fact he was a famous person?
He was a famous person that has had a huge impact, not just on psychology. You know, we were talking earlier about how students come into general psychology classes and they think we're going to talk about Freud. Well, his name is, everybody knows that name. Everybody knows the name of Sigmund Freud. He had a huge impact. I went to a vet one time to talk about my cat, and the answer he gave me about my cat and the behavior of my cat was so Freudian. And I'm like, you're a vet and this is a cat, you know? But he's had that kind of influence, that all facets of life. All those terms like ego, that's Freud's term. You know, libido, that's Freud's term. Trying to think, id is Freud's term.
And a Freudian,
anal retention.
Anal retention. And a Freudian slip.
Freudian slip, yeah. And he didn't call them Freudian slips, but he called them slips of the tongue, and then we called them Freudian slips. So he has just permeated our society. Even the court's view that children, when there's a divorce, belong with the mother, it goes back to Freud.
Really? Mm-hmm. Now elaborate on that. That's an interesting point.
Well, Freud's theory is that our personality develops. We start out with this unconscious aspect of our personality, and then the conscious part builds in through the first 5 years of life. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, nothing really important happens as far as creating our personality. And so children need to be with their mother during the formative years because they're the ones that are most important with the things that happen, you know, all the different stages. I don't know if you want me to go into what those stages are, but it's really the mother, the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage. The father doesn't really come into it until the phallic stage, which is from 3 to 6 years old. So important for him to be there at that point. But the younger ages, it's really the mother.
So it really does go back to our childhood.
Yes,
that's another expression. It goes back to your childhood. Mm-hmm. Is that valid in most cases?
Childhood's very important. I believe most psychologists, whether they're Freudian or not, are going to tell you that those first few years are critical. Yes.
So, if Freud is not the entire Psychology 180, who else do you talk about in there that people don't know? But our kids are surprised. I trust the first day of class, you sort of throw that out and they think, oh, well.
There's a lot of important people. You may have heard of John Watson. He had a very important impact because he was the one that really kind of moved us away from Freud for a while. Freud became the answer. All the idea of the unconscious mind and all that was the answer for a number of years, and it was really Watson that talked about behaviorism and the environment, and he really never, the behaviorists don't believe in even looking at the unconscious mind. I don't think they believe it exists, and even if it does, it's not important. The environment is important. So Watson made a huge turnaround in psychology and became the answer for all problems for a number of years.
Was he American or British?
He was American.
Yeah.
University of Chicago.
But of course the fact that he attacked Freud makes Freud important because you don't attack unimportant people.
Right.
Now, was then Watson attacked by others and said, well, you're not right either?
Yes, Maslow came along in the early probably before that, but in the 1960s and 70s is when Maslow's theory, the humanistic theory, came along, and they never really took over the field of psychology, but became one of the three main theories: the Freudian theory, the behavioral theory, and then the humanistic.
Well, explain that. What is that, the Maslow theory?
Maslow,
the humanistic theory?
he believed that we have a motivating force that guides us to our greatest good, and he talked about people becoming self-actualized. He uses like a pyramid as his graphic to describe how we move up our needs hierarchy from the basic needs like food and water and shelter all the way up to self-actualization would be the highest point. He uses a pyramid because there's more people down here needing, all caught up in just making sure they get fed or have water, or place to live, than people who are self-actualized, which a self-actualized person would feel like all their needs were met, and they would concentrate on helping others.
That's almost like the Greek philosophers, that there's more to life than just the basics, that you critical thought.
Right, but you can't get to that point unless your basics are covered. Like if you're
Right,
starving,
of
you
course,
can't think
of
about,
course, of course.
anything beyond
yeah,
that.
Sure, that makes perfect sense.
But a lot of the psychology comes from philosophy. That some of the things I've read about Freud, he drew upon Plato, and there's a lot of Socrates and Descartes and all of those in psychology.
It's amazing in teaching European history what a debt we owe the Greeks, and so much of it goes back. And of course, the Oedipus complex comes from Oedipus Rex.
Freud. Yeah, but that's Freud. It's interesting too, because Freud used that term, but it came from Rex Oedipus. It came from Greek, but he used that term, and then he questioned whether who wrote that.
Sophocles.
Homer. Oh, Sophocles. Who he questioned whether the author had some of those same issues that he talks about with that Oedipus complex, that he just didn't know. He just hadn't labeled those things yet, but that those things were going on, because Freud really thought that was so key, that Oedipal complex that we all go through, or all males go through. That love of the mother. And
now that also obviously is one reason why Freud was so controversial. I mean, this stuff is, this to most people's perversion, doing...
I try to cover that in my classes in a way that they can see that doesn't have to be perverse. Freud had kind of a, I don't know if you want to call love-hate relationship with his father, but fear and love kind of relationship with his father, and a very loving, devoted kind of relationship with his mother. And I guess he assumes everybody, is like that. So he very much emphasized that sexual aspect, but there's ways of looking at that even if you don't buy into the sexual part, you can still see that he could be right.
Interesting. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, he would say little boys, the Oedipal complex would say little boys are sexually attracted to their mothers, and they fear their fathers because they're afraid their father will find out, and actually their fear is castration, that their father will castrate them. But you can look at little boys, and it's not unusual for a 2-3-year-old boy to be a mama's boy, to prefer to be around mom and to kind of be a bit intimidated by their dad. Then when they get to be about 4, 5, 6, they begin to identify with dad, and they repress those feelings for mom. Well, if you ask a little 3-year-old boy who they're going to marry when they grow up, 9 times out of 10 they say mom.
Right. And that's normal.
And we don't think anything of it.
Right.
It's just that he tied that into the libido. He used that term libido, I think, more broadly than we have translated it to be. We translate that just as sex drive. But the libido is a drive that we're born with that motivates us even as infants to bond with our parents. It's the libido that he would say. It just also has the sexual parts as well.
We were also talking before the program began about, you mentioned some new research suggests that the mind may not be in the brain.
Right. And I actually don't know enough about that to go much further than that, but there is no proof that the mind resides in the brain. We have no way to prove that. It could be anywhere or nowhere. You know?
And of course, in the ancients, it was the heart. And we still talk about an affair of the heart. That came from the heart.
Breaks my heart.
It breaks my heart. And the symbol of Valentine's Day is a heart, not a brain. And I guess one of the things that's always fascinated me about the mental process is that, as we were talking before, if you break your arm, perish the thought, but if you do, you go to the hospital, they x-ray it, there's the broken bone, we put a cast on it and we can fix you up. But if you have a broken mind, so to speak,
how do you fix it?
How do you fix this? And that's the thing that's always fascinated me about treating mental illness is where do you start? How do you find it?
And that's why there is no perfect solution to that. There is no, you can't look it up and say, here's the remedy for it, because you could look it up and there could be 10 different remedies. And they might all work or none might work. You know, there is no clear cut, this is the way that we fix the mind. The thing with Freud too is that, or any other theory, Maslow's theory, how do you prove it right or wrong? How do you say he was right about the edible complex? Or how can you prove that he's not? He could be right.
Right. and again, and of course, we can use the x-ray to prove that your arm healed because you can see it.
Right.
And plus you can use your arm.
And even if somebody gets better with psychoanalysis, are we sure it's the psychoanalysis that got them better? You know, could their mind not have healed without it? You don't know. Whereas the arm is unlikely. It'll heal, but it won't heal right.
Right,
You know?
exactly. Did Freud, again, drawing from my very limited knowledge of him, wasn't a big thing listening to the patient, that the patient talked, and to be a good psychoanalyst, you've got to be a good listener.
Right.
Isn't that pretty much true of being a psychologist as well? Don't you all do a lot of listening?
You should, yes. You listen. Freud believed in letting the person talk, just keep going and going and going. He used what's called free association, where he would say a word or a sentence and then let the patient just say whatever comes to their mind. He believed that way you got at the unconscious mind because it didn't get guarded by the ego. It allowed just information to flow freely. So yeah, you just had to listen, and then the next word that he might say might come from what that person had just been going on and on and on about. You know, so he would have to listen to that. He also believed a lot in dream interpretation.
He was into that?
Oh yes. Any book that you would buy today that looks at dream interpretation, that believes that dreams symbolize something, is based upon Freud's work.
Explain that. I mean,
he called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. That he believes that when you are asleep, your ego or your guard is down, and so only that part of your unconscious mind then is free to control your dreams or show up in your dreams without that guard. And so if you could keep a diary or journal of your dreams, then he could look at those and try to see if there was some kind of symbolic element to it. So if you dreamed about getting on an airplane and flying to Canada or something, then that was just what he called manifest content, the overt content. But the unconscious part, or the latent content, would be, what does that airplane symbolize? What does Canada symbolize? What does flying symbolize? You know.
Well, I can only speak for myself, but my dreams are pretty crazy. You mentioned an airplane, it might be flying backwards, and it might be powered by horses or something. I mean, it makes no sense. Dreams are just crazy. And how could you make any sense of that? Dreams never make sense.
It wouldn't probably be just one dream. He would have you keep a log of your dreams and then start looking for certain things that keep showing up, and they may show up in different forms, and try to see if that could represent something that you've repressed, and it's trying to come out in your dreams.
Well, I always looked at, and I think I read this somewhere, that there was some theory that what a dream is that when you're conscious, your mind is regulating your thoughts and making airplanes be powered by engines and not horses. But when you're dreaming, it's just this free flow and all this stuff is just going crazy in there.
Yeah, the frontal part of your brain is the part that controls reason and logic, and it's the part of our brain that tries to tie things together and analyze things and try to make sense out of different events that might all somehow be related. Well, when you're asleep, that part of your brain isn't active during the REM sleep when you dream. And so it's the other part of your brain that doesn't really have any logic to it or anything like that.
It's just going crazy.
Yeah.
Right.
And then you try to make sense out of it, and of course it doesn't. It doesn't seem to.
In modern psychology, I mean, how big are dreams? Are they?
It just depends on the person. I think more of the dream research that's going on today looks at dreams as being less significant in their content and more just in that the physiological elements that you need that time of your sleep, because your brain is very different during REM sleep than it is during non-REM sleep. And so that part of our sleep is very, very important. But the content of the dream, according to most modern theories, is irrelevant. It's not important.
Well, that's good to know, because with the airplanes being powered by mules, that's I thought, oh, something's wrong.
Of course,
with
transportation, according to Freud, was always sexual.
that.
So if you dream about flying or riding on a train or in a car, it has to do with sexual. And water is always sexual. Of course, pretty much everything is sexual when it comes to Freud.
Well, I mean, in all seriousness, yes, I suppose it could be, but I mean, now most people, your students, if you were to, they would probably laugh if you said, if you think about transportation, it's sexual. You get in your car to go home, you get on trains, planes, airplanes, it's all sexual. Now, wouldn't most people think, now, come on, that's just, where did he get that?
Movement through space. I don't know. I'm not sure where.
Well, now, isn't that people said about that Freud was hung up on sex, that everything was sex?
That ties in. I mean, that's what makes people think stuff like that.
Right.
But, you know, because he had the phallic symbol, you know, he's the one that came up with that whole concept of the phallic symbol, and most means of transportation are longer than they are wide, and that's where we come up with those ideas. And then if you tie water into it, then you really get where he comes up with the sexual elements.
Right.
Right.
So to summarize Freud, everything goes back to our childhood and sex.
Well, the libido, yes.
The libido.
Which is present from the moment we're born.
Right. Well, again, psychologists, so they wouldn't ask you, what did you dream last night, if you went to us, probably.
No. Not unless you went to an analyst, and there are not that many of those, especially not in Paducah, Kentucky, that I know of.
Well, getting back to Freud before I forget, is there any percentage of success rate with his patients? How successful was he in curing them?
Well, I suppose if you were to ask Freud, he would say highly successful, but I really don't know if there's any numbers on, because psychoanalysis tends to last a long time. So he probably didn't have a great number of people that he cured, but he saw like the same people for years and years and years.
Well, you know, it was the joke, you know, in movies, Woody Allen, well, I'm in analysis. I'm in analysis. And it was this long process. And you went to this.
And he will be for the rest of his life, probably.
So how do you know if you're cured?
Well, you probably aren't ever cured. With analysis, the goal of it is not so much a cure, but self-understanding, being able to understand yourself. And I guess it's taken Woody Allen a long time, I don't know. Right. Because I think he goes daily.
Right. And that's part of his shtick, the neurosis. He's the neurotic comedian. So if you went to a psychologist, you would maybe you wouldn't go as often.
Right. Like once a week or every 2 weeks, and you could probably, depending upon what you were going for, 3 visits might be enough, or it might be 10 visits, you know, or just really.
But does a psychologist also listen and try to get you to sort of solve your own problems?
And especially the humanistic, we talked about Maslow, they believe that you are the one who needs to fix whatever's wrong, and they just act like as a facilitator. They don't tell you what's wrong, and they don't tell you how to fix it.
Well, in the literature, is there, well, you mentioned Freud, you mentioned Watson, you mentioned Maslow. Are any of them more successful than others, that method?
It depends on what you call success. I would say Watson and the behaviorists probably have numbers on their side, because they tend to be the ones that say, well, let's say if you're trying to quit smoking or something like that, they have very behavioral techniques, and you can do it in this many sessions, and you can change that behavior. So they're very much into just having a behavior change, and it doesn't take so long to do that. But if you're talking about, first off, trying to help somebody learn how to help themselves, like Maslow would do, that's going to take a lot longer, rather than telling you, fix it this way. I'm telling you how to fix it, is shorter than me trying to get you to understand yourself and how you got that way. I mean, that's what Freud would be doing. He would want you to know what happened in your childhood that caused you to think you have to wash your hands all the time. What is it that caused that? And then let's help you become the kind of person who doesn't need that anymore.
So, and we have about a minute left. Identify yourself. Are you a Freudian, a Watsonian, a Maslowist, if I may use those terms? What are you?
I'll do the default thing and say I'm eclectic, but my training is more behavioral. My graduate degree, my program was very behavioral, and I came out of grad school very behavioral. I'm going to tell you what's wrong, and I'm going to tell you how to fix it, and you just do that and you'll be fine. But today I probably would look at some other approaches. I don't know that I would ever be Freudian or consider myself Freudian, but maybe a little bit humanistic.
Well, that's the open-minded way, and I suppose Freud probably would appreciate that in the end, I guess, being open-minded. So we're out of time. Thank you for joining us today. My guest was Sharla Krupansky, Professor of Psychology at the college. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.